She was 20 years old, and her family had cast her out with a worn bill worth $20 and the clothes on her back. She had no plan and nowhere to go, just a small, polished stone in her pocket and a story her grandfather once told her about a wagon train swallowed by the Mojave Sand 90 years before. With that story as her only map, she walked into the desert to find what the manifest had left off the record. But what nobody knew, what even her grandfather had only guessed at, was that inside the last wagon, buried under a century of heat and silence, was a future she could claim as her own. Settle in close and listen. Let us know where you're watching from tonight. Margaret Cole was raised on a hard scrabble farm in the dry hills bordering the Great Desert, a place where the wind scoured the paint from the house and hope from the heart. Her parents were practical people, their hands calloused from work and their words pared down to necessity. Love was a full silo, affection was a mended fence, and a child's worth was measured in the weight they could lift. Margaret had two older brothers, both built like their father, solid and silent and capable. Margaret was built differently, leaner and more watchful, with her grandfather's eyes. Her grandfather, Elias Cole, had been a prospector in his youth and a well-digger in his later years, a man who understood the language of stone and water. He had lived with them until he died when Margaret was 16, and in those years, he was the only one who saw the girl for who she was. He taught her not how to plow or mend, but how to read the land. He showed her how a line of cottonwoods meant water hidden deep underground, how the color of a rock could speak of iron or copper, and how the shape of the clouds in the late afternoon could foretell a flash flood or a week of blistering sun. In his small, dusty workshop behind the barn, a place that smelled of oil and metal and dry wood, he taught her the proper use of his tools. He showed her how to sharpen a knife on a whetstone until it could shave a hair from her arm, how to set a rivet, and how to splice a rope so it was stronger than before it was broken. He spoke to her of the world beyond their fences, of geology and history, and of the lost stories the desert held. His greatest treasure was a heavy wooden chest filled with maps, geological surveys, and newspaper clippings yellowed with age. It was from that chest he pulled the story of the Silica Queen, a wagon train that vanished in the summer of 1852, supposedly hauling silver ore, but rumored to be carrying something far more delicate and strange. He believed they had been caught in a singular, violent sandstorm that had not just buried them, but shifted the very landscape, hiding them from all who searched. He had a theory about their location, a place where the prevailing winds carved out a deep basin between two low mesas. It was their secret, a legend they tended together. The day before he died, he gave her a small gray stone he had cut in half and polished. It was a thunder egg, an unprepossessing rock on the outside, but inside it held a star of pale blue agate. Don't ever let anyone tell you what something is worth just by looking at the outside, he had told her, his voice a dry rasp. That stone was the only object she owned that had been given to her out of pure affection, and she carried it in her pocket always. After his death, the workshop was cleared out. His maps burned for kindling, and Margaret became just another pair of hands, her unique skills seen as useless eccentricities. The end of her life on the farm came not with a shout, but with the quiet scratch of a pen on paper. The drought had taken the last of the crop, and her father, a man hollowed out by failure, had sold the last productive parcel of their land to a cattleman from the east. The deal was done at the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten their spare meals in silence for 20 years. Her father counted out a few bills, separating them into small piles. He had made arrangements for her brothers to work for the new owner, their strength being a commodity he could bargain with. For Margaret, there was no arrangement. The cattleman had his own family, his own workers. There was no place for her. Her father slid a single $20 bill across the worn wood of the table. His eyes did not meet hers. They were fixed on some distant point out the window, a place she could not see. "This is what's left for you," he said. The words were not cruel, not kind, just a statement of fact, as final as a field report. There was nothing more to say. She did not cry or plead. An argument would have been as pointless as yelling at the wind. She simply nodded, picked up the bill, and went to the small room she had always shared with the scent of drying herbs and the sound of the wind under the eaves. She packed her life into a small canvas satchel. It did not take long. She took the knife her grandfather had taught her to care for, its blade gleaming and sharp. She took the whetstone, the tin cup he had given her, a coil of good rope, and a sturdy water skin. She folded her spare shirt and trousers. At the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of soft flannel, she placed the thunder egg. She walked out of the house without looking back. Her mother was at the stove, her back to the room. Her father was still at the table, staring at the grain of the wood. Her brothers were in the barn, their voices a low murmur. No one said goodbye. She walked down the long dirt track that led away from the farm, the place that had been her whole world, and did not stop until the house was just a speck against the brown hills. She felt not grief, but a strange, quiet emptiness, the clean feeling of a slate, wiped bare. The only thing she had left of any value was a story, a secret whispered in a dusty workshop years ago. She turned her face toward the south, toward the vast, shimmering expanse of the Mojave, and began to walk. The $20 bill was folded neatly in her pocket, a brittle piece of paper that represented the sum total of her family's obligation to her. The agate, smooth and cool against her palm, felt infinitely more valuable. It was a promise. The journey was a lesson in solitude and survival. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, bleaching the color from the sky until it was a pale, hazy blue. The air was so dry it seemed to pull the moisture from her skin, and the silence was a living thing, broken only by the rasp of her own breathing and the scuttling of unseen lizards in the scrub. She walked with the steady, ground-eating pace her grandfather had taught her, a rhythm that conserved energy and covered miles. She thought of his lessons. Walk in the cooler hours of the morning and evening. Rest during the high sun. Never drink all your water. Always leave a third in reserve. She followed the faint traces of old game trails, her eyes scanning the ground for tracks, for the subtle signs of life the desert offered to those who knew how to look. She found water at a small seep, a patch of damp sand at the base of a rock outcropping that she recognized by the cluster of hardy green plants growing there. She spent an hour digging with her cup, waiting patiently as the hole slowly filled with cloudy, precious water. She filtered it through a piece of her spare shirt and filled her water skin. The simple act, a profound victory. At night, the desert transformed. The oppressive heat gave way to a surprising chill, and the sky became a vast, deep bowl of stars, more brilliant than she had ever seen them from the farm. She would build a small fire from creosote branches, the wood burning hot and fast with an acrid, resinous smell. She ate sparingly from the small sack of jerky and dried fruit she had bought in the last town, making it last. She was not lonely. The silence felt like a kind of companionship, and the presence of her grandfather felt intensely real. She would take out the agate and turn it over in her hands, the polished surface cool against her skin, and she could almost hear his voice. telling her to observe, to be patient, to trust what she knew. She was heading for the place on his hand-drawn map, a location marked with a small, confident X in faded ink, the Basin of Whispering Winds. He had named it himself. It was a journey of over 100 miles on foot, a distance that would have seemed impossible to the girl she had been a week ago. But out here, time and distance felt different, measured not in days or miles, but in sunrises, in the finding of water, in the slow, steady progress across an unchanging landscape. She was being stripped down to her essential self, to the core of competence and resilience Elias Cole had so carefully nurtured. The farm, her family, the life she had known, it all seemed to be part of a distant dream. The only reality was the sun, the sand, and the story that pulled her forward. She found the first sign on the 10th day. She had reached the basin, a wide, shallow depression between two long, low mesas, just as Elias's map had shown. The wind moved constantly here, a low, mournful sound that gave the place its name. For a day, she saw nothing but sand and rock. She was beginning to feel the first tendrils of doubt, a cold whisper that told her she had been chasing a fool's story. But her grandfather's voice was stronger. Look for what is out of place. And then she saw it. Not a wagon, but a sliver of dark wood, weathered to the color of bone, protruding from the crest of a dune. It was unnaturally straight, its grain running contrary to the patterns of the desert. Her heart, which had been beating with a slow, steady rhythm, gave a single, hard thump. She scrambled up the dune, the loose sand sliding away under her boots. It was wood, all right. Hardwood. Oak. She began to dig with her bare hands, the sand hot against her skin. The piece of wood grew, widening into the curved top of a wagon wheel's felloe. Below it, she uncovered a rusted iron tire, pitted and scaled, but still intact. It was real. The story was real. She worked for the rest of the day, fueled by a surge of adrenaline that pushed back her exhaustion. The single wheel led to an axle, and the axle led to the ghost of a wagon bed, its planks scoured and bleached by 90 years of sun and sand. Most of it was empty, a hollow rib cage filled with drifted sand. By sunset, she had uncovered the remains of 3 wagons, all in a similar state of decay, their canvas covers long since disintegrated, their contents reclaimed by the desert. There was nothing of value here, nothing but brittle wood and rusted iron. Discouraged, she made her camp in the lee of the largest wagon, a meager shelter against the persistent wind. As she sat chewing on her last piece of jerky, she looked out across the basin. The setting sun cast long purple shadows, and in the changing light, she saw something she had missed before. The line of wagons did not end where she had stopped digging. Further on, a larger mound rose from the desert floor, its shape subtly different from the natural dunes surrounding it. It was steeper, more consolidated. She realized that the lead wagons had been exposed to the worst of the elements, but those at the rear of the train might have been more protected, buried deeper by the initial storm. Hope, tenacious and bright, flared again in her chest. She had not yet acquired the heart of the discovery, only its weathered shell. The real prize, if there was one, lay beneath that deeper sand. The next morning, she would start again, not just with her hands, but with a plan, and with the scavenged tools of the dead. She had found their graveyard. Now she would learn its secrets. The work of excavation was a brutal, painstaking process. Margaret rose before the sun, the air cool and still, and began her assault on the large mound. She had scavenged a broken shovel blade and a heavy iron pry bar from the wreckage of the first wagons, crude tools that nonetheless felt like a gift. She worked with a methodical rhythm, the way her grandfather had taught her to approach any large task. Break it down into smaller, manageable parts. She focused on one section, digging away the top layer of loose sand, then attacking the harder, compacted sand beneath. The sun climbed, and the heat intensified, reflecting off the pale sand until the air shimmered. Sweat soaked her shirt and trickled down her face, leaving salty tracks in the dust on her skin. Her muscles ached, a deep, burning protest in her back and shoulders. But she did not stop. Each shovelful of sand was an act of defiance, a refusal to be beaten by the desert or by the quiet dismissal that had sent her here. She was not just digging for a wagon, she was digging for a foothold in the world. By midday, she had uncovered the top of a canvas-covered hoop, the fabric miraculously preserved in places where the sand had been deepest. It was brittle and tore at the slightest touch, but its presence confirmed she was in the right place. This wagon was far more intact than the others. She kept digging, her movements becoming slower but no less determined. She drank from her water skin, rationing the warm, metallic-tasting water. She thought of the people who had been here, trapped in a roaring, blinding storm of sand. Had they been afraid? Had they known they were going to die? The silence of the basin felt heavy with their unspoken story. As the afternoon wore on, she finally cleared enough sand to reveal the rear of the wagon. It was a heavy freight wagon, built of thick oak, its tailgate secured with a heavy iron latch. The wood was silver gray and splintered, but it was solid. The latch was rusted shut. She wedged the pry bar into the seam and put her full weight on it. The metal groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to tear the silence. With a final, wrenching shriek of metal on metal, the latch gave way. The tailgate sagged open, spilling a cascade of fine sand onto the ground. She peered into the darkness within, her breath catching in her throat. The air that drifted out was hot and dry, smelling of ancient dust and something else, something faint and chemical. The interior was not empty. It was filled with wooden crates, neatly stacked and braced against the wagon's sides. They were covered in a thick blanket of dust, but they were whole. She had found it. The cargo the manifest had never mentioned. She used the pry bar to force the lid of the nearest crate. The nails screeched as they pulled free from the dry wood. She lifted the lid and looked inside. Her first feeling was one of confusion, then disappointment. The crate was packed with straw, and nestled within it were not silver bars or valuable goods, but pieces of glass. Thick, curved pieces of glass, some as large as dinner plates, others smaller and more complex. Lenses. The next crate held more of the same, along with prisms and brass fittings of intricate design. The entire wagon was filled with the components of some massive optical instrument. It was a cargo of scientific equipment, valuable to the right person, certainly. But to her, here, in the middle of the desert, it felt like a cruel joke. Exhausted and disheartened, she slumped against the side of the wagon. Had she come all this way for a collection of useless glass? But then her grandfather's words returned to her. Don't ever let anyone tell you what something is worth just by looking at the outside. She had to see it all. She went back to work, methodically opening each crate. In the very last one, tucked away in a corner, was something different. It was a small, heavy box, about the size of a loaf of bread, bound with iron straps and lined with lead. It was far too heavy to be filled with glass. With trembling hands, she forced the pry bar under its lid. The top popped open with a soft puff of contained air. Inside, nestled in velvet that had mostly decayed into dust, were three things. First, a small stack of double eagle gold coins, their surfaces gleaming dully in the dim light. There were perhaps 50 of them, a small fortune, enough to buy a house, a business, a new life. Second, there was a leather-bound journal and a sealed letter. The paper yellowed, but the ink still dark and clear. And third, lying beside the letter, was a small object wrapped in what was once a silk handkerchief, a wooden bird, carved with exquisite detail from a single piece of dark wood, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. She reached in and picked up the letter. The wax seal crumbled at her touch. The envelope was addressed in a neat, elegant hand. To whomever finds this in God's time. She unfolded the single sheet of paper and began to read. The voice that spoke from the page was calm, precise, and filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to echo across the 90 years. My name is Samuel Thorne. I was, until this storm, an optician and lens grinder from Boston. The date is August 14th, 1852. If you are reading this, then my journey, and the journey of those with me, has ended here. The letter went on to explain the cargo. The lenses and instruments were for a new astronomical observatory to be built on a mountain east of San Francisco, a project that had been his life's work. He wrote of his belief in science, in the power of looking at the heavens to understand one's place in the universe. Then the tone of the letter shifted, becoming more personal. I undertook this journey alone. My wife, Eleanor, and our daughter, Lily, were meant to travel with me. They were taken by the cholera in St. Louis. I buried them myself, by the side of the wide Missouri River. I am a man of science, but my heart is an empty vessel. This observatory was to be their legacy, a way of looking up, of seeing beyond the grief of this world. He described the sandstorm, how it had come upon them without warning, a solid wall of yellow dust that blotted out the sun and choked the air. He knew they were lost, their animals dying, their water gone. He was writing this by the last light of a flickering lantern inside the wagon. I leave what little wealth I have in this box. Use it to build something good. The journal contains my notes, my designs. Perhaps they will be of use to someone. The small bird was a gift I carved for my Lily. She never saw it. Perhaps you can give it a home. Do not mourn for us. We were simply people who tried to carry a fragile thing across a harsh land. I have no fear. I will see my Eleanor and my Lily soon. I only hope that the sky above you is clear. He had signed it simply, Samuel Thorne, Stargazer. Margaret sat in the sand, the letter in her hand, and for the first time since leaving the farm, she wept. She cried for Samuel Thorne and his lost family, for a man who faced his end with such quiet dignity, and she cried for the profound, impossible kindness of a stranger, a hidden benefactor who had reached across a gulf of 90 years to give her a future. The gold was a tool. The journal was a legacy, but the small wooden bird was a connection, a piece of a stranger's love that she now held in her own hands. The discovery changed everything. The gold was a means, but the letter was a purpose. Margaret knew she could not abandon Samuel Thorne's legacy in the desert. She had a responsibility to him, to the fragile thing he had tried to carry. Her first priority was to get back to civilization. She carefully repacked the lead-lined box, securing the coins, the journal, and the wooden bird. She took one of the largest lenses, wrapping it carefully in her spare shirt, as proof of her claim. She sealed the wagon as best she could, marking its location on her grandfather's map with a precise and steady hand. Then, with a new sense of direction, she began the walk out of the basin. The journey was different this time. She was no longer a drifter, but a woman with a secret, a treasure, and a task. She walked for 3 days, her water skin nearly empty, until she saw the smudge of smoke on the horizon that meant a settlement. It was a small, dusty mining town called Prospect's End, a collection of weathered wooden buildings clinging to the side of a sun-baked hill. She walked into the town's single street, attracting curious stares. She was a strange sight. A young woman, alone, covered in dust, her clothes ragged, but her eyes clear and determined. Her first stop was the general store. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s with wise, dark eyes and work-roughened hands. Her name was Alma Reyes. Margaret bought a new water skin, a sack of flour and bacon. She paid for it with a single $20 gold coin from Samuel Thorne's box. Alma looked at the coin, then at Margaret, her expression unreadable. She gave Margaret her change in silver dollars without a word, but a silent understanding passed between them. The gold bought her more than supplies. It bought her a measure of respect. Her next task was to find a way to move the wagon. She needed help, and she needed tools. Alma directed her to the blacksmith's shop at the edge of town. The smith was an old man named Jedediah Stone, with a great white beard and arms as thick as oak branches. He was hammering a glowing piece of iron on his anvil, the rhythmic clang echoing through the dusty air. Margaret waited patiently until he was finished. She explained what she needed: a sturdy mule, a block and tackle, and help in salvaging a heavy wagon. She didn't say where or what was in it, only that it was old and deeply buried. Jed was skeptical, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he studied her. "That's a man's work, girl," he said, his voice a low rumble. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "I've done the digging myself. I just need help with the lifting." She showed him the lens. He took the heavy piece of glass, turning it over in his huge hands, his skepticism slowly turning to wonder. "I'll be," he murmured. "Never seen glass like this." He agreed to help, for a fair price and a share of any salvageable iron. He was the first person who had not questioned her ability, but had simply seen the evidence and made a practical decision. He was a man, like her grandfather, who understood the world through tangible things. Together, they made a plan. The rebuilding was not of a house, but of a possibility. The final piece of her plan fell into place when a young Paiute man named Kai came into the smithy to have a horse shod. He was quiet and observant, and he moved with an easy grace that spoke of a life spent in the open country. Jed introduced them. Kai knew the desert better than anyone. He knew the hidden trails, the hard-packed ground that could support a heavy wagon, the places to avoid. Margaret offered him a share of the salvageable wood from the other wagons, wood being a scarce and valuable commodity in the desert, if he would guide them and help with the recovery. He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to take in her entire story, then gave a short, decisive nod. The community was forming, not through declarations of friendship, but through a series of quiet, practical agreements. Alma provided them with provisions for the journey. Jed supplied the tools and the expertise. Kai offered his knowledge of the land, and Margaret provided the purpose, the driving force born from a stranger's letter and a grandfather's story. With her small team assembled, she felt a strength she had never known before. the solid, reliable strength of shared work. The salvage operation was a testament to ingenuity and hard labor. Kai led them back to the Basin of Whispering Winds, along a route that wound through canyons and across dry lake beds, a path that would have been invisible to an outsider. When they arrived, Jedediah Stone stood before the half-buried wagon and let out a long, low whistle. 90 years, he said, running a hand over the weathered oak. Built to last, these ones were. The three of them worked together with an unspoken efficiency. Jed, with his immense strength, rigged the block and tackle to a sturdy rock outcropping. Kai, nimble and quick, cleared the remaining sand with a tireless energy. Margaret directed the operation, her voice calm and steady, drawing on the mechanical knowledge her grandfather had given her. They used jacks and levers to lift the wagon's frame, shoring it up with rocks as they worked. Jed examined the axles and wheels, his experienced eye spotting cracks and weaknesses. They spent a full day making field repairs, using iron strapping and ingenuity to reinforce the undercarriage until Jed declared it strong enough for the slow journey back. Getting the heavy wagon out of the deep sand was the hardest part. They hitched the mule, along with Jed's own powerful draft horse, to the wagon tongue. The animals strained, their muscles bunching, but the wheels only spun uselessly. It was Kai who solved the problem. He had them lay down planks scavenged from the other wrecks, creating a temporary road over the softest sand. On the third try, with Jed and Kai pushing from behind and Margaret guiding the animals, the old wagon lurched forward with a groan of ancient wood and began to move. It rolled out of the sandy grave where it had rested for 90 years and onto the hard-packed desert floor. It was a moment of quiet triumph. They spent another 2 days dismantling what was left of the other wagons, loading the good wood and iron onto the salvaged freight wagon. As they worked, a quiet camaraderie grew between them. They shared their water and their food, and in the evenings, they sat around the fire, speaking little but sharing a sense of accomplishment. Margaret told them the story of Samuel Thorne, reading his letter aloud by the flickering firelight. When she finished, there was a long silence. "A good man," Jed said at last, his voice rough with emotion. Kai simply nodded, his eyes on the brilliant stars overhead. They were no longer just salvagers, they were custodians of a legacy. The journey back to Prospect's End was slow and arduous, but they made it. When the strange procession, the ancient, heavily laden wagon pulled by 2 mismatched animals and escorted by the old blacksmith, the young Paiute, and the dust-covered girl, rolled into town, people came out of their homes and the saloon to stare. Margaret was no longer the anonymous stranger who had walked in a week before. She was the woman who had walked into the desert and returned with a ghost. She was the wagon girl. The story of her discovery spread through the town, growing with each telling. She became a local legend. But Margaret paid little mind to the stories. She had work to do. With a portion of Samuel Thorne's gold, she made Jed an offer to buy his blacksmith shop. He was getting old, his back stiff in the mornings, and he was ready to retire. He accepted on one condition, that he stay on for a year to teach her the finer points of the trade, the secrets of tempering steel and welding iron that could only be passed from master to apprentice. She agreed immediately. The blacksmith shop became her home and her business. The unwanted, abandoned building at the edge of town, just like the wagon, became her anchor. She had a place. The front of the shop was for the forge and the anvil, where she did repairs for the miners and ranchers. But in the back, she built clean, sturdy pine shelves. There, she carefully unpacked Samuel Thorne's cargo. She cleaned each lens, each prism, each brass instrument, her hands gentle and precise. The glass, once a source of disappointment, now felt like the most precious treasure of all. People knew her name. Alma would bring her a hot meal in the evenings, refusing payment. Kai would stop by on his way through town, bringing news from the desert or a piece of unusually beautiful wood for her to admire. She had found more than a wagon. She had found a community. Small rituals began to form. The smell of coal smoke from the forge in the cool morning air. The shared cup of coffee with Jed. The quiet evenings spent cataloging Samuel Thorne's instruments by lamplight. The wagon, a burden of history, had transformed into a livelihood, a home, and a purpose. It was not a fancy life, but it was warm, functional, and hers. Months passed, turning into a year. The rhythm of her life was set by the heating and cooling of iron, by the needs of her neighbors, and by the slow, patient work of understanding Samuel Thorne's legacy. The blacksmith shop was no longer just a place of work. It was a sanctuary. The scent of coal smoke, hot metal, and oiled leather was the smell of her independence. The tools on the walls were not just objects. They were extensions of her hands, instruments of her will. Jed had taught her well, and now she could shoe a horse, repair a broken axle, or forge a new gate latch with a confidence that felt as solid as the anvil she worked on. The people of Prospect's End had accepted her as one of their own. She was Margaret, the smith, the woman who could fix anything. They brought her their broken tools and their troubles, and she listened to both with the same quiet attention. One evening, as the sun set behind the western hills, casting long shadows across the dusty street, Margaret stood in the back room of her workshop. The forge was banked for the night, its embers glowing with a soft, orange light. A gentle warmth filled the space. On the shelves before her, the lenses and prisms of Samuel Thorne's telescope were arranged in perfect order, each one cleaned and catalogued. They caught the last rays of sunlight, fracturing the light into 100 tiny rainbows on the wooden walls. She reached up and took down 2 small objects from the top shelf. In her left hand, she held the thunder egg her grandfather had given her, its polished agate star a cool, smooth weight against her palm. In her right, she held the small wooden bird that Samuel Thorne had carved for his daughter, its delicate wings seeming to tremble with arrested motion. She held them together, one from the man who had given her a past, and one from the man who had given her a future. She thought of her father's house, of the silence at the kitchen table, of the $20 bill that was meant to be the end of her story. She had walked away from that life with nothing but a stone and a memory, and they had led her here. She had faced the desert alone, had dug a future out of the sand with her own 2 hands. Samuel Thorne, a stranger she would never know, had trusted her. Elias Cole, her grandfather, had believed in her. Jed, Alma, and Kai had helped her. She placed the agate and the bird side by side on the shelf, 2 small, beautiful things that had been carried across a harsh land. They belonged together. Margaret Cole was 20 years old when she was cast out with $20 to her name. She had walked into the desert with nothing but a story. It was the best inheritance she had ever received,